Mike Pompeo, the current CIA director, has been chosen by Donald Trump to replace Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. So naturally, the Senate needs to have hearings to question Pompeo and determine whether or not he is fit for the position. Now, to give you a quick rundown of who Mike Pompeo is and what his beliefs are, in the past, he has made statements denying climate change, opposing same-sex marriage, arguing that moderate Muslims are complicit in terrorist attacks. And also, he has demonstrated on various occasions that he has a very hawkish stance on foreign policy. So especially when it comes to Iran, North Korea, Syria. So these are all issues that senators wanted to ask him about. And what I did was compile what I consider to be the more interesting exchanges during these hearings. Now, the hearings are ongoing. I'm sure we'll have more content for you moving forward. But it's important to know that right now there are people on both sides, members of Congress on both sides, that are very much concerned with the State Department. Dozens of senior officials resigned or were pushed out. Many jobs remain unfilled, with lower level officials temporarily filling them. With the administration proposing State Department budget cuts of 31%, fewer young people are being recruited to join the next generation of diplomats. So morale is low within the State Department. There are positions that need to be filled within the State Department. And right now, of course, there is an effort to replace Rex Tillerson with someone who would be competent. And you get to decide for yourself whether or not you think that. Now, let's go to Rand Paul's exchange with Pompeo. This exchange has everything to do with foreign policy, something that I tend to agree with Rand Paul on. And you're gonna see a lot more commentary from Senator Paul as opposed to answers from Pompeo, but I do think this is an interesting exchange. So let's take a look at the first video.
Do you think it's constitutional? Does the president have the constitutional authority to bomb Assad's forces? Does he have the authority, absent congressional action, to bomb Assad's forces or installations?
Those decisions are waiting. Every place we can, we should work alongside Congress to get that. But yes, I believe the president has the domestic authority to do that. I don't think that has been disputed by Republicans or Democrats throughout an extended period of time.
Actually, it's disputed mostly by our founding fathers who believe they gave that authority to Congress.
It's interesting because Pompeo had a very different standard when it came to foreign policy under the Obama administration. So, Michael, I want you to jump in and kind of fill in the gaps here.
Well, I mean, first of all, the gap, there's no gap to fill in there. Rand Paul called him out on it, and what Mike Pompeo, as he was a member of the Freedom Caucus, he was a member of the most sort of conservative group of congressmen when he was serving.
He was a member of the most arch-conservative group of arch-conservatives.
Right, that's right. Yeah, he was the far right of the far right. He was the walking fringe. I mean, and so what he advocated at a time when Obama was considering doing certain things was exactly what Rand Paul is saying to him now. Now, as he's standing for Secretary of State, it's a total reversal. And I think that, a tiny bit of leeway is given to people who are going to adhere to the administration of their president. It's happened all the time. This is so far from the person he was and legislated as and got himself in wars of rhetoric with Barack Obama over, or his administration over. Obama would never honor that. It's embarrassing.
Well, it's also incredible how he tried very hard to present himself as a less hawkish individual. Because again, if you look at his past statements, didn't want to shut down Guantanamo Bay, is very much in favor of the enhanced interrogation that was conducted under the Bush administration, basically torture, waterboarding. So again, very hawkish, but during this hearing, what I noticed time and time again was that he wanted to present himself as someone who was more in favor of diplomacy, which historically is not the case with Pompeo.
No, I mean, it's what you do. You go into a job interview if I'm trying to think of a good analog to what that is. But the truth is, you present yourself as what you think they want to hear.
Exactly.
And that's what he's doing today.
There's no, again, we've crossed into a period with conservatives, elected conservatives in this country. There is almost no principle, and their partisanship, while accusing the Democrats of being partisan, and everybody is capable of being partisan, they're out of control. I mean, there is no principle on which they stand here. If it was Barack Obama was a Democrat, so you opposed him. The Freedom Caucus theoretically wanted limited government, right? And so, and the thought was what we were peddling, which at least those guys were principled. You know, we may disagree with everything, and they may sort of advocate. They end up sort of perhaps unwittingly, but probably completely wittingly, sort of giving a voice to a significant amount of hatred in the name of fiscal responsibility. But in reality, they didn't believe anything. They just, this was what worked. This was what worked then. It was popular. It was the right people for him to be associated with, so he was associated with them. He is a better nominee for Secretary of State than Rex Tillerson, because Rex Tillerson was a 0 on a 1 to 10 scale, and Mike Pompeo is a 1.2.
Yeah.
But it is a continued disaster for the State Department.
But do you really think that he would be better than Rex Tillerson? Because while Rex Tillerson didn't have the same contacts, connections, experience as Pompeo is definitely more hawkish than Tillerson was.
No, just in terms of qualification for the job.
I think Rex Tillerson is the worst cabinet appointment in the history of the United States of America. And I think he'll go down as that. I think he's wrecked the State Department. I think that he's the guy who allowed a 31% budget cut to be proposed at his State Department while we increased the defense spending by 13%. I mean, it is counterintuitive in any way to making progress. It's nice that those numbers directly mirror each other, at least the 13% increase.
It was like appointing a surgeon to housing and urban development. Like you wouldn't do, well, wait a second.
But I mean, worse than that is that Tillerson again, and thank God he's gone, because and we liked him a little because he recognized the moronity of Donald Trump, but it didn't really matter. Like, this was still a guy who ran a giant oil company to whom the State Department was a thorn in their side. They had their own foreign service. They had their own diplomatic corps. They had their own military at Exxon. And then we turned this guy loose. And to them, the State Department and diplomacy was tightening of their belts, was infringed on their ability to make a profit. I mean, he was literally the worst person in the world for by far the most important cabinet job that we have, by a landslide. As bad as Ben Carson is, as bad as Betsy DeVos does, the damage they can do is so limited in comparison to the State Department. I'm not delighted that Mike Pompeo was there. He's a horrible choice. Tillerson was worse. That doesn't mean we don't get outraged about Pompeo.
To this point, a Republican congressman in D.C. said to me when I was last there, that Mike Pompeo is unqualified but ambitious. And within these spheres right now, ambition is winning, and that's what you have here.
Ambition is scary when it comes from someone like Pompeo.
Yeah.
So I hear what you're saying, Ben, but my worry is that he is more aligned with Trump when it comes to the worst ideas that Trump has in foreign policy.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And Tillerson, but
and I know that Tillerson wasn't really a mitigating factor when it came to Trump. I mean, Trump didn't really respect him, and he was just as marginalized as Kelly is at the moment.
But he did mitigate on Israel, on the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, it was Tillerson's voice in the room that caused the president not to go all the way in that. So he was heard. Yeah, so too was Mattis.
He got one, but in
no, but I'm not saying.
I know. I got you.
It doesn't undo any argument you're making.
Yeah, he was. So again, this is a crazy conversation that we have to have in America, where it's like, who do you think should be Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson or Mike Pompeo? And it's like a joke conversation. But yes, and they are both terrible in their own interesting ways. Unquestionably, one of the ways that Pompeo is dangerous is that he could appeal to Trump's most interventionist, darkest, most militantly belligerent side.
Do you think the Iraq War was a mistake?
I was running a machine shop in Kansas at the time, so I don't have a contemporaneous view that I expressed.
No opinions back then? How about opinions now?
I may well have had an opinion.
But
no, my opinion now is, look, we had bad intelligence.
But it's not just bad intelligence.
But we did have bad intelligence.
We did geopolitically the wrong thing. We got rid of the enemy of Iran. We emboldened Iran. We made it worse. We brought chaos to the Middle East. But your president said it very clearly. He says that the Iraq War was the single worst decision ever made. So once again, I'm concerned that you won't be supporting the president, that you will be influencing him in a way that I think his inclinations are actually better than many of his advisors, that the Iraq War was a mistake, that we need to come home from Afghanistan. He was against being involved in Syria at many times in his career. So I think he does have good instincts. And my main concern is that will you be one who will listen to what the president actually wants instead of being someone who advocates for us staying forever in Afghanistan, another Iraq war, bombing Syria without permission? So these are the advice you will give.
These hearings are always funny because anytime they're asked about something that would make them look bad if they answered truthfully, they don't recall.
Right.
They just can't recall. I don't remember.
But like these are unbelievable times, and I'm reminded. I was listening to Springsteen radio oddly today. Weird. And it was his introduction to the song "Magic" from 2007, and he said, "We're in unprecedented times now." And I thought, 11 years ago, nope. They've been reprecedented, right? And there are two things here that would make every Republican not vote for them if this were not vote for this guy, so that he'd have to withdraw his name. The committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, would say something. We can't support this guy.
Yeah.
One, he's going to be not. He said, I don't know. I was running a machine shop in Kansas at the time. You're about to be Secretary of State. It's the biggest foreign policy decision in the United States over the past 50 years, probably, right? And he's like, I don't know. I was running a machine shop. I don't know. That's crazy. You can't have the job then. I want somebody who has an opinion and a thoughtful opinion. And he goes, well, interesting, because the consensus is that we made a mistake. I'll tell you why I disagree with that. Some answer that suggests that you've thought about it. Not, I was running a machine shop. I'm not going to answer that. And then Rand Paul, who is going to be championed by the left and the right for standing up to this, for the recognizing the mistake that we made in Iraq. Then in the middle of that undermines, to me, all credibility that Rand Paul would have when he says, I think Trump has good instincts. Right? No, he has incompetent instincts, and if Rand Paul were true to the person he was, he would be a significant thorn in Donald Trump's side instead of the fake thorn in Donald Trump's side that he is. My hunch is that he gave this answer to Rand Paul. Rand Paul has two reasons not to support him. Now,
he's his neighbor.
Right, Rand Paul will, right, they live next to each other and they get into a fight. And my hunch is Rand Paul will vote to confirm Mike Pompeo. So it's so nonsensical. And we've seen two great reasons why this guy should never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, be secretary.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is political theater. An attempt to make sure their constituents see that they're speaking strongly about things that they support and that their constituents support. I mean, an example of that would be the Senate hearings with Mark Zuckerberg.
Right. Well, that's the best example.
That is the best example. It wasn't even about protecting data or privacy. It was more about, I'm a conservative lawmaker and I am very outraged that you are censoring conservatives, which they're not, but nonetheless.
Right. When there's a sexy witness, everyone in Congress wants to question.
Right.
So there was political theater there, no question. But they weren't interviewing Zuckerberg for a job.
You're right. Yes.
And here, although maybe it was political theater, it was actually revelatory. Like those were Rand Paul asked questions that taught us something, right? But it won't matter. It doesn't make any difference that it taught us. And that's what gets me, is that maybe it's supposed to be political theater, but oh wait, this is good theater. Like this something interesting happened, and it won't make any difference whatsoever.
If you become a member of the Young Turks, you'll be saying,
I'm like a smart person.
So do it right now. TYTnetwork.com/join. Get the whole Young Turks show every day.